This report does not seek to fascinate, it seeks to understand. Understanding is not excusing, it is refusing to let it happen again in the shadows.
A quiet factory worker applies paint to commercial trucks. He attends church and shows neighbors photographs of his young son. He was an apex predator. His hidden crimes completely shattered this fragile illusion. What does it take for an ordinary person to become a predator? And how does society fail to see it? Throughout this analysis, we will refer to our subject as the River Ghost. Operating in the shadows of the Pacific Northwest, he orchestrated a devastating string of attacks. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, the subject navigated marginalized communities, actively seeking out highly vulnerable targets along the desolate stretches of the highway network. He seamlessly blended into the background, utilizing a plain appearance to successfully evade the mounting police scrutiny and a massive, highly publicized task force investigation. Law enforcement agencies struggled for years to connect the fragmented evidence left behind at various outdoor crime scenes, facing a seemingly impossible and sprawling puzzle. The profile reveals a methodical approach to these events, utilizing vast, overgrown environments to conceal the grim reality of his actions from the vigilant public eye. He manipulated the harsh terrain, creating a vast geographic web that prolonged the agony of families and continuously frustrated the dedicated investigators seeking elusive justice. Only the eventual evolution of advanced forensic science could finally piece together the microscopic traces, definitively anchoring the profile to the sprawling series of crimes. This long investigation forces us to confront the terrifying camouflage of normalcy. It exposes the profound vulnerabilities hidden within the everyday infrastructure of a modern society. The subject possessed an entirely unremarkable social facade. He blended seamlessly into society, hiding a profound pathology behind the perfect illusion of absolute normalcy. For 3 decades, he maintained highly stable employment in an industrial factory setting, consistently painting commercial vehicles. This steady routine successfully anchored him within the mundane working class. To his peers, the profile appeared quiet, cooperative, and deeply devoted to religion. He openly read scripture during work breaks, projecting an impenetrable aura of civic morality. The subject built a domestic shield, entering into multiple marriages over the years. His partners viewed him as a dutiful spouse, oblivious to the darkness beside them. Psychologists define this survival strategy as compartmentalization. He effortlessly separated his extreme predatory urges from his civic persona, shifting smoothly between roles to evade detection. He exhibited no overtly menacing traits. His surprisingly mild manners and low intelligence served as the ultimate camouflage, effectively disarming the natural defense mechanisms of society. His psychological manipulation of perception was masterful. Even when questioned by investigators, his rehearsed innocence allowed him to successfully pass a polygraph test without triggering alarms. Yet, this flawless social performance was merely a fragile curtain. Behind closed doors, the crushing pressure of his suppressed, hidden reality was quietly preparing to shatter everything. The mask of absolute normalcy is broken. The deep developmental fractures are understood, and the institutional collapse of his predatory system is now entirely complete. We have mapped his methodology, his psychological origins, and his inevitable downfall. We now possess all the critical elements required to definitively classify this archetype. The subject's childhood was defined by severe domestic dysfunction and psychological abuse. He was raised by a highly domineering mother who routinely subjected him to profound emotional humiliation. His early development was marked by prolonged enuresis. When this occurred, his mother imposed degrading ritualistic punishments, washing him in freezing water to inflict maximum psychological shame. These deeply traumatic episodes were compounded by highly inappropriate boundaries. She frequently recounted provocative encounters with other men, creating an overwhelmingly toxic emotional environment for the youth. This continuous psychological exposure generated a severe internal fracture. He slowly developed incredibly conflicting feelings of intense attraction and immense, suppressed rage toward the primary maternal figure. Meanwhile, his father remained entirely passive, silently accepting the domestic abuse. However, he frequently voiced an intense, aggressive contempt for the sex workers he encountered daily. The profile completely internalized this extreme domestic duality. Facing significant academic failures and social inadequacy, he retreated into deep isolation, cultivating highly disturbing, violent internal revenge fantasies. Seeking to reclaim a sense of control, he began exhibiting early indicators of severe deviance. He set fires and directed growing sadistic aggression toward neighborhood animals. Adulthood brought military deployment and romantic rejection. His first marriage ended in infidelity while he was overseas, solidifying deep hatred and an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. To combat crippling insecurities, he actively sought out marginalized individuals, demanding absolute compliance. Whenever he perceived any minor rejection, his suppressed rage became dangerously volatile. The toxic blend of early humiliation, deeply fractured identity, and a desperate need for absolute power had crystallized. What happened when this fragile psyche finally shattered completely? The subject's modus operandi was highly structured and repetitive, designed entirely for utility and evasion. He hunted exclusively along desolate stretches of the local highway network. To secure immediate compliance, he manipulated perception. He displayed photographs of his young child to vulnerable targets, instantly projecting the reassuring image of a safe father. He utilized his vehicle as a mobile, isolated containment zone. This practical method ensured absolute privacy, allowing him to operate efficiently without any external interruption. But an MO only explains how a predator operates. The signature reveals why. His signature was a profound psychological compulsion, completely detached from any practical utility. He did not use firearms or blades, relying entirely on physical strangulation. This clinical, hands-on method required extended proximity, fulfilling a deep need for absolute dominance. The compulsion extended far beyond the initial attack. The profile reveals a disturbing habit of returning to the hidden geographical sites long after the event concluded. Profilers understand this specific behavior as a manifestation of ultimate possession. He also engaged in elaborate scene manipulation, scattering unrelated debris to confuse the frustrated investigators. For nearly 2 decades, this dual mechanism of practical evasion and psychological gratification functioned flawlessly. The predator was operating perfectly, but every system eventually breaks down. The subject's carefully constructed illusion first cracked when a vigilant witness followed his distinctively painted truck as it left the scene with a targeted victim. Law enforcement investigators questioned the profile directly. Shielded by his disarming, mundane demeanor, he feigned absolute innocence and surprisingly managed to successfully pass a polygraph examination. He quietly slipped through the grasp of law enforcement, retreating back into his ordinary life while the massive task force struggled against mounting, completely unorganized evidence. Years later, relentless detectives executed a critical search warrant at his residence, seizing a simple saliva sample that would remain dormant in police evidence vaults. For well over a decade, the investigation went entirely cold. The subject believed he had permanently outsmarted the system, resting comfortably behind his perfect working-class camouflage. However, he could not outrun the relentless evolution of forensic science. Advanced genetic profiling eventually resurrected the cold case, analyzing the long-forgotten microscopic biological traces. The final, devastating blow came from specialized industrial analysis. Experts discovered incredibly rare, microscopic spheres of spray paint embedded deep within the victim's discarded clothing. This highly specific chemical signature definitively linked the outdoor crime scenes directly to the factory floor where the subject had maintained decades of stable employment. The authorities surrounded him as he left his workplace, completely shattering his mask of normalcy. The untouchable predator was finally placed into secure police custody. The immense institutional pressure had finally crushed his impunity. Yet, this long-awaited capture was merely the prologue to an infinitely darker, far more complex psychological interrogation. The subsequent legal proceedings revealed a highly calculating individual. Facing the ultimate penalty, the subject entered a complex plea agreement to guarantee his own survival. To avoid execution, he traded the hidden locations of the missing for his life. This unprecedented negotiation exposed the cold, transactional nature of his psychology. During the agonizing sentencing phase, his demeanor remained chillingly flat. He sat motionless as grieving families directed decades of built-up rage and sorrow toward him. He recited his horrific actions with a terrifying absence of genuine human empathy. The court observed a predator completely disconnected from the gravity of his crimes. Ultimately, the justice system imposed an overwhelming number of consecutive life sentences. The profile was permanently removed from society and strictly confined to maximum security isolation. He exchanged his expansive geographic hunting grounds for a bleak, structured existence behind thick concrete walls. The elusive phantom was reduced to a compliant inmate. Prison records describe him as a highly cooperative and docile prisoner. This immediate submission to institutional authority perfectly mirrors his lifelong capacity for behavioral compartmentalization. The devastating scale of his actions left a profound, lingering scar on the community. Countless families endured decades of agonizing uncertainty, constantly waiting in the dark. The eventual confessions provided fragmented, painful closures for many. But the emotional damage inflicted upon the families and the region remains entirely incalculable and permanent. His long operation exposed severe societal blind spots. It highlighted how marginalized populations could vanish seamlessly without triggering an immediate or adequate institutional emergency response. The profile thrived by targeting those living on the fringes of society. He exploited a tragic systemic failure that routinely overlooked the disappearance of vulnerable individuals. Beyond the social tragedy, this sprawling investigation permanently transformed modern law enforcement. The sheer volume of evidence forced an evolution in criminal tracking and data management. The massive task force revolutionized how complex, multi-jurisdictional cold cases are managed. Their meticulously archived evidence remained perfectly preserved, waiting patiently for technology to catch up. It catalyzed massive advancements in strategic forensic science. The eventual breakthrough relied entirely on the pioneering application of complex genetic profiling and microscopic chemical analysis. Invisible biological traces and microscopic industrial paint spheres finally destroyed his impunity. These forensic victories set a new global standard for prosecuting long-dormant serial crimes. The predator believed he had successfully outsmarted the authorities. He failed to anticipate that the relentless progression of microscopic science would inevitably illuminate his shadows. The aftermath of this investigation serves as a grim but vital textbook for behavioral analysts. It completely redefines our understanding of the organized, highly compartmentalized offender. His ability to maintain stable employment and domestic relationships while operating as an apex predator shattered previous assumptions regarding the predictable decline of serial offenders.
The mystery is over. The trump card is on the table. So, did you recognize him?
The subject we have been analyzing is Gary Ridgway, historically designated by law enforcement as the Green River Killer. For the purpose of our profiling framework, we classify him under the archetype of the river ghost. This alias was chosen because it perfectly captures his method of operation. A phantom entity drifting silently along the margins of society, emerging from the shadows to strike before vanishing back into the dark currents of his ordinary life. To truly understand the mechanics of his evasion and his pathology, we must evaluate him through the Pentagon of Evil framework. Ridgway is officially linked to 49 confirmed victims, though he later claimed responsibility for over 70. His most distinctive features were his terrifyingly plain appearance, his low intellect, and his stable employment as a commercial truck painter. These remarkably mundane characteristics provided the ultimate camouflage, allowing him to operate undetected in plain sight. Premeditation, 8 out of 10. Ridgway's attacks were highly calculated and opportunistic. He targeted a specific, highly vulnerable demographic, sex workers and runaways along the Pacific Highway South, because he knew they would not be immediately reported missing. To lower their defenses and gain compliance, he frequently displayed photographs of his young son to project the reassuring image of a reliable family man. He prepared his vehicle as a mobile containment zone and actively scouted isolated environments in advance to conceal the crimes. Signature, 6 out of 10. Beyond the practical methods of his crimes, Ridgway exhibited a deep psychological compulsion to maintain absolute control over his victims even after the attacks concluded. He deliberately posed bodies in remote, overgrown clusters and frequently returned to these hidden sites to assert his dominance. Furthermore, he engaged in elaborate scene manipulation, strategically scattering unrelated debris, such as cigarette butts and gum wrappers to confuse investigators and protect his psychological sanctuary. Mobility, 5 out of 10. Ridgway was primarily a geographically stable offender, anchoring his operations tightly within Washington state. The vast majority of his crimes occurred within a confined radius in South King County, utilizing his deep familiarity with the local highway networks and the Green River area. However, he occasionally demonstrated strategic mobility, deliberately transporting a few victims across state lines into Oregon specifically to disrupt police jurisdictions and complicate the ongoing task force investigation. Resistance, 9 out of 10. His ability to evade law enforcement was extraordinarily high. Ridgway operated with near impunity from 1982 until his arrest in 2001. He successfully passed a police polygraph examination in 1984 and continuously deflected suspicion by maintaining a stable marriage and employment. He blended perfectly into the working class. It required nearly 2 decades of advancements in microscopic forensic science, specifically DNA profiling and industrial paint analysis, to finally pierce his impenetrable camouflage. Impact, 9 out of 10. The devastation Ridgway inflicted upon the Pacific Northwest is immense. He shattered dozens of families and exposed a tragic societal flaw that left marginalized populations completely unprotected. Structurally, his case forced a permanent evolution in criminal investigation. The sheer volume of evidence accelerated advancements in multi-jurisdictional data management and forensic trace analysis. He changed the history of criminology, proving that the most prolific predators can successfully hide behind a mask of absolute normalcy. Final score, 37 out of 50. When we synthesize these metrics, we are left with a highly organized, compartmentalized predator. So, what does it take for an ordinary person to become a predator? And how does society fail to see it? It takes a fractured psychology fueled by early developmental trauma, masked perfectly by the mundane routine of an ordinary job and a suburban home. Society fails to see it because we are conditioned to look for obvious monsters. We ignore the quiet, plain men who seamlessly navigate our blind spots, exploiting the vulnerable populations we have already chosen to look away from.
Some monsters are born in the shadows. Others are the shadow itself. The verdict is etched in stone, but make no mistake, evil never stops. It simply changes its face. Many more monsters await dissection on this channel. Stay vigilant. Case closed.